sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. My name is Kevin Larimer. I am the editor-in-chief of Poets and Writers, and I am here with Patricia Engel and Rivka Gelchin to talk about their novels Infinite Country and Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that we'll save the last 10 minutes of this 30-minute live event to respond to audience questions. You can start submitting your questions on the event page at loc.gov/bookfest now, if you'd like. In the meantime, I want to thank you both, Rivka and Patricia, for joining me here.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. It's a real honor to join you here. So these books are so different, but they are both incredibly accomplished, richly woven tales that center on families. It's been such a pleasure to read them side by side, and I'd like to start with a question for each of you that I hope will give some indication to those audience members who haven't read the books, this sort of deeply rewarding reading experience that awaits them. So Patricia, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. Infinite Country is this beautiful and heartbreaking story of a Colombian family fractured by immigration and deportation, and their experiences over a 20-year span beginning in the late 1990s. The family is made up of undocumented and citizen family members, which allows you to explore the whole idea of citizenry, connections to one's homeland, immigration laws, and the arbitrariness of physical borders as they relate to a family's fierce and enduring love for one another. It's such a close look at one specific family, but I know their immigration experience is hardly unique. In your acknowledgments, you thank the families who will likely see aspects of their experience reflected in your novel. And I wonder if you could speak to your vision for this book and what real life stories you may have drawn from for inspiration.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. You're right. This is a very typical story, the story of this family of five in Infinite Country. They're a mixed status family, which is to say that the parents arrived to the United States on tourist visas. And because of, life happening, just a turn of events, they decide to overstay, not with the intention of ever being immigrants, really just an accumulation of days and months and years. And all of a sudden, they have an entirely new life in a new country. They have a daughter who was born in Colombia. They have two children who were born in the US, and the youngest who was sent back and lives her entire life in Colombia. So this is a family split apart across two countries and who have their lives defined and challenged by paperwork that changes year by year and means different things according to different administrations. And it seems so unlikely to some people, so complicated to some people, but in fact, this is the sort of existence that is so typical to so many. So it was not difficult for me. I didn't have to reach very far, really, for inspiration because I am the daughter of Colombian immigrants. I've been raised among immigrants and in immigrant communities all my life, and I've known people very close to me, some of the people I love most in this world and admire most in this world from all over the world, whose lives have been challenged for these same reasons and who've been separated from their families for the same reasons. So this is a story that is very close to me, although I have to say this family's immigration story is not my family's immigration story. My parents' immigration story is different. Although there are some commonalities in terms of a lot of Infinite Country set in Bogotá, and that's my mother's hometown, for example. But I wanted to write a story that really reflected what it was like to be a family that's in the active process of immigrating, because many of us who are children of immigrants have immigration as part of our present reality or in the not so distant past. But other people, even though this is a country, made up of immigrants, whether they arrived a long time ago or recently, a lot of people have largely disassociated from their immigrant roots. And I wanted to write a story that really shows the nuances of it, which is that it's often very complex and full of doubt and regret and wondering if you made the right choice. And maybe you didn't make the right choice. And it's full of profound homesickness and loss, almost like a sort of death. And that's what I witnessed among immigrants my entire life. And I wanted to write into that space in a way that showed one family's collective experience, but also the private experience of each family member as a result of that experience.
Right. Yeah, and it's just such a profound experience to be reading, you know, a story like this in your novel, and then see it being played out in real life. You know, all over. Of course, there's what's happening down in Del Rio, and you know, so many real life examples of exactly what you wrote about. Yeah. Turning now to you, Rivka. In Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, we are placed in 17th century Germany, where we meet Katharina Kepler, who comes under suspicion of being a witch and must endure this sort of long, protracted trial that threatens not only her life, but also the livelihoods of her family, which includes her son, the imperial mathematician Johannes Kepler. And this is, in fact, a piece of historical fiction. Katharina and Johannes were real people. Rivka, in the acknowledgments of this terrifically, you know, funny and humane and moving book, you write that you've never enjoyed working on a book as much as this one. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the experience of researching and writing this book, and why it was so enjoyable for you.
Yeah, you know, I never thought I would be a person who would write a book of historical fiction, and part of that is because I don't know, I didn't feel I had a gift for it, and so I really came to this accidentally. Like it sounds like silly and emotional, but the book sort of, it forced itself on me, where I was reading a lot of nonfiction, a lot of biographies of scientists, and as I was reading this biography of Kepler, the best biography of Kepler was one from an angle, which was actually the story of his mother's witch trial, which even like 100 years later, they kept trying to cut it out of his biography. And it just seemed so close to me. It seemed like I really felt like these were people who had almost had too much faith that what was actually true, and that reason and logic and the truth would yield for them and would keep them safe, and would kind of make the strongest arguments. And that was not the way that it was going to pan out. So that something about that was like a bridge for me to a lot of the emotions of being alive in the past decade. And so that's sort of how the book came to me. But it was fun, partially because I was researching it, and also because this family seemed like a wonderful family. Like I felt like they were put under the most tremendous stress. And it was not just the stress of your mother being treated in a horrible way, but the stain of her being a witch, or potentially being a witch, cast a pall on all the children. And to see the way that they managed it, and in fact, historically, there's every indication that they managed it quite admirably. And so that added this like kind of element of joy to what was a very, you know, sad story. But it felt like also a kind of a joyful story to think about, because they were such a remarkable, emotionally remarkable, on top of the son being one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. But it was a family that was poor, a family that came from nowhere, that had to face a lot of troubles, and that natural strength was its own kind of joy, as were, of course, like just all the details of a time that was so far away, but also so close. So you sort of see the kinds of arguments that would be settled in courts about, that were basically the equivalent of like a bar fight today and someone's ego being hurt. And you just thought it just the same. Like it just like was humorous, and in like that horrible way where you just thought, oh, like all this kind of pettiness and bruised ego and kind of wasted energy is just like eternal. So right. It was really fun to work on.
Did you find yourself straying from the actual fictional, you know, facts of the case? Like, did you feel sort of like you needed to stick to exactly how it happened, or like how much freedom did you feel like you had with that?
Yeah, well, so one thing is Katerina Kepler herself was illiterate, and so we don't really have really any, almost no record of her voice. So there was a huge void that kind of needed to be written into. And then also, like in a funny way, I did play with the historical truth in the sense that it was actually even worse than I put it in the book. And the reason I wanted to change that was because I felt that she was actually under trial for 6 years. And although I'm accurate about that in the book, I kind of wave my hand so you don't quite notice that 6 years have gone by. And I did that because I was conscious, and I know that Patricia is also, I'm sure, conscious of these same issues, to avoid that sense of kind of lurid enjoyment of horrible situation. I thought, I know this woman wouldn't tell her story this way. Her family wouldn't tell her story this way. They're all going to, on some level, with their voice, cover up their suffering, even as they reveal it. And I just didn't want the book to emphasize in an morally wrong way, like, oh my God, look how horrible it was. It was so horrible. It was so horrible. So that it becomes a kind of pornography of misery. I thought, like, that's not the way these voices are going to tell that story. So I did a bit of hand waving, even though I did literally stick to the record, but in terms of the order I told it in, things like that.
Right, right. That's really interesting. One thing I noticed about both of these novels is that the characters use kind of oral stories to convey some of the themes that run throughout. Rivka, Katerina Kepler, and others often reference, I guess you'd maybe call it folklore, stories of the crow who entered a contest to become the king of birds, and the band of animal musicians trying to escape slaughter. And Patricia, in Infinite Country, you use Andean myth and traditional knowledge spoken through stories to convey so much about the movements of your characters, both internally and across physical borders. And I'm wondering if you could both speak to the use of these sorts of stories within the story and how you compiled them. Patricia, do you want to start with that? Like, was this something that you knew these the Andean myths and you wanted to use them in the story, or was it something that you discovered through your research and the process of writing it?
It's a bit of a combination of all those things that you mentioned. As I said, my mother's from Bogota. She's from the region, and her family's been there for ages. So a lot of the stories that are particular to that region, which was the territory of the Muiscas, were one of the four advanced civilizations of the Americas. A lot of those stories I grew up with because of my mother. And then over the years, just spending more time in Colombia, I learned more. My curiosity as a writer, just one thing leads to another. And then traveling around the country, I learned more of the mythology that's not specific to the region of what is now Bogota, but to other regions, very distinct regions around the country. So those, came to me through my heritage and my curiosity. And as I was putting together or figuring out how to tell the story of this family, well, I realized those are stories that have been important in my, migration story. And as I've gotten older, I've really come to understand in a different way how stories, in the case of immigrants, or as I mentioned, people who have it in their recent family history, your stories are often the only thing that you take with you when you immigrate, and they're very quickly lost, almost as quick as language is lost from one generation to the next, if you don't repeat them, if you don't share them constantly. Our stories are constantly at the threat of extinction. And so I have felt much more of a sense of purpose and connection to those stories that we do still have. You can imagine we have those, but also imagine how much was lost in the way that I just described. But also an interesting parallel for me is always when your family, your parents, or maybe your grandparents, or maybe you were the one that created that rupture between the country that was left and the new country where your family's making a life, or you are making a life. You've disrupted your family history. You have changed everything, really, for the whole course of your family. The next generation will be different as a result of that decision or indecision or circumstance that just, created that movement. So that in itself becomes a sort of mythology in a family. I know, that I know the story of my family's migration story. I know it so well as I know a myth, as well as I know other kinds of history. And that becomes family lore, family myth. It's the story that you repeat so you understand yourselves, so you know how you got here, and you know who you are, you know who you were. Because the thing is that when you come to a new country, there are no reminders. You leave everything. You leave your home, you leave your family, you leave your friends, you leave everything that told you who you were. As if you could forget. But of course, in a new country, there's no one to tell you who you are except your stories. So.
That's a beautiful, I love that. The sort of through line across generations is the one thing that's sort of connects everyone, right? That's great. Rivka, what about the stories that your characters tell?
Yeah, I mean, as when I was reading Patricia's book, I also was like very moved by those stories, because it's the story, and it's also, you think to yourself, who were the people that were telling this story and not another story, and why did they tell it this way and not another way, and which details become prominent and which are subdued, and how do they get retold and changed, is like a kind of like message from the past and from the past storytellers, and somehow like a more durable message than a straightforward nonfiction account of what happened. They have like different powers, and there's like a very special power, kind of density and reduction in myths and folk tales and fairy tales, and that density I think is quite amazing. And in my book, one of my main narrators is Katharina Kepler, who is herself like about 70 years old for most of the book, and illiterate. But of course, like the more I learned, I understood that it was generally older women who were telling stories, and all those stories like the Grimm's fairy tales, or even Hans Christian Andersen, they were writing down the stories that the old women in their life had told them. So that was basically how it went. In fact, there's a beautiful story about how the Grimm brothers were kind of staked outside of the old age home, and they knew there was a woman there who had a lot of great stories, and she didn't want to tell them, basically because the stories were, in her mind, for girls, like almost like a secret feminine line of transmission. And she knew these guys were trying to collect these stories. Anyway, she didn't want to do it. So they paid like a young girl who was a maid in the old age home, and basically asked her to listen to the stories and try and remember as much as she could and share them. And I had that in mind with Katharina, because I thought, well, it just seemed clear to me that this was a woman who was very intelligent, very capable. She was widowed early on. She had to make her own money at a time when it wasn't really appropriate for it. There were a lot of ways in which women's earning their own money was itself suspicious. And being a vulnerable woman who others needed to care for also made it more suspicious. So I just thought, like, it's a very exceptional woman who did these things, and it seemed natural to me that her stories would be a way of passing on her advice, because that was like more the way that things were told rather than directly. Because I feel part of what's so special about stories is there are things that, for whatever reason, are very difficult to tell directly, maybe because they're painful, maybe because they're forbidden, maybe because they're subconscious. And so the story does this amazing transformative magic. And I felt that a lot when I was reading Patricia's book as well. And you sort of see like how the reality was transformed into this more durable form that could travel across time and be told and retold, and people could add their own way of relating to the story when they retold the story. So it just was very clear to me, all right, this older woman is going to be a person who relates her experiences in this way.
Right. That's great. And it's a nice transition to the next question, which is, has to do with the theme of the National Book Festival this year, which is open a book, open the world. So the question is, how have books opened the world for you? Patricia, do you want to maybe start?
Yeah, sure. Well, in the old days, I was just a Colombian girl growing up in New Jersey, and I felt a bit isolated, and I certainly didn't see any Colombian girls from New Jersey in any books that I read. So I was a big reader, and I loved books, but there were a lot of books that spoke to me in different ways, but there was never sort of like the book, you know, that reflected any kind of reality that I identified with. But there are some of these books that, you know, spoke to me in very profound ways, and that are probably still the books that are the most part of my writerly DNA, and because they opened the world to me, and showed me a world much bigger than the ones that I knew. Were writers who were writing in some form of exile, who were writing as outsiders in one way or another. So some of those writers were like Albert Camus, Marguerite Duras, Anaïs Nin, Colette, Maryse Condé. And so a lot of these writers were sort of displaced in one way or another. And of course, I was too young to, you know, recognize that. I just felt something. I just connected to some sort of quality in their prose or in their point of view that I connected to. And that in itself just opened the world of possibilities to me in what could exist. And not only what existed in humanity, but what existed in art and what could be done, and what sort of voice could claim a space for itself on the page.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Rivka, do you have an answer to how books have opened the world for you?
I mean, I feel like very similar to Patricia. I actually grew up not in a bookish household, not with like a lot of books, but like Patricia, I was a child of immigrants. I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma. My parents, my mother was born in Egypt. My father was born in Palestine and Israel. And I just like, I didn't articulate it, but I did have this sense that I was hungry to like know more of the world, even though I actually think I had like an idyllic childhood in Norman in many ways. And actually for me, like in a funny way, like I remember some of the books that were most meaningful to me where my brother was 6 years older than me and not really a reader, not someone who processes the world through books, has like a totally different way of expanding out into the world. So basically when he went to college and they sort of forced him to take at least one class where he read books as opposed to manipulated numbers, he just sent them to me and said, can you just summarize these for me and let me know what happened in them? And so for some reason, those books seemed especially charged because I felt like I was like out of my age group and had access. And I remember specifically the copies he gave me, those kind of like great kind of mass market paperback Malcolm X, great mass market paperback Madame Bovary. And those, it's not like they were the only books that opened the world for me, but I remember that sense of like graduating out of what was available right next to me and into these, you know, like telegrams. They almost feel like telegrams of kind of other interiorities and other ways of, they just felt enormous. Like that thing about a book I love is that it feels like you drop it in water and it reveals that it's like actually enormous once you sort of hydrate it. So that was just, it's still the way I relate to the world best. And I, you know, I think often there's this sense of like, oh, is that somehow, is that like a screen? Am I like basically spending my time in a screen? And, but I think, but instead it sort of feels like a passport, I guess. Like it feels like you get permission to go places that are otherwise like not necessarily available to you.
Right, a passport. I love that, a passport to the world. Thank you. So I think we'll move over to audience questions now. We may not get to all of the great questions submitted, but we will certainly try our best. We have one from Robert who asks, how important is it for your stories and characters to have relatable experiences? And then he goes on to say, immigration today is relatable, but witchcraft is not as much. Is this important?
Yeah, no, I do think that, you know, I do think like a book opens up if you feel there's some bridge into it. And I think that's so personal in a weird way, although it's true. I've like never been persecuted as a witch. I felt like I related to her more than I related to other people around me, just because that sense of being in perilous trouble and you don't really feel very hopeful about how to get out of it. So like, I just think that's so personal. And I actually did start writing that book because of people close to me in situations that seemed like logic, reason, and facts were not on their side. I mean, even though they had logic, reason, and facts on their side, that was like insufficient. And that experience, watching people suffer in that way, was, I think, why I connected to this story.
Right. Well, and that's the whole reason we read books, right? Or read novels, is you may not relate exactly to the specific experiences of the characters, but you're looking for that sort of universal human connection that will allow you to, feel empathy. And that's the whole point, right? I mean, Patricia, it seems to me like, when I was reading your novel, it's the human experience of these people who are, the family is torn apart, and, based on these sort of somewhat arbitrary laws that all of a sudden, like, no, you can't reconnect with your family member. And I don't know, I just, there is a human element to that anyone could connect with. I mean, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Well, you would be surprised, Kevin, because a lot of people can't. And I think the thing about relatability is a lot of that doesn't fall on the writer. A lot of that falls on the reader. And sometimes there's things that I would think, or anyone would think, how could you not relate in some way, or just
Right.
on a human level to something? And some people don't. Some people have a harder time, looking beyond their sphere of experience. I think something that certainly I never expected or never could have predicted is that my book was released during the pandemic, when most American families got a taste for the first time of what it's like to be separated from their loved ones for reasons beyond their control. And not because of laws or paperwork per se, but because of things like quarantines and risks of infecting them and death and all sorts of things that we were not prepared for, and that a lot of people just didn't know how to cope with. And those are things that a lot of families, like the family in my novel, live with year after year after year, of not being able to see your dear ones for special occasions, to celebrate holidays, to be there when they are ill, when they're in the hospital, to attend funerals, to say goodbye. And a lot of Americans experience that in the past year and a half. And I think maybe that for some people that shifted something in how they, can read a story like in Infinite Country. But really, that's entirely up to the reader.
Right, of course. I have a question from Anna. I'm a huge fan of you both. Are you working on anything new you can share? What's next?
In my case, I have a short story collection coming out next year called The Faraway World. And then I'm in the very, very early steps of a new novel.
Wonderful.
That's exciting. I'll be excited for that. I'm actually working on a nonfiction book about the lives of scientists, which was what I was working on before I interrupted it to write this novel. So hopefully I will be interrupted again, but my plan is to keep working on that.
Okay. I wanted to ask, as long as this is, the National Book Festival, we'd be remiss if maybe we didn't talk about reading a little bit too. And I wanted to ask, what are you both reading these days? And do you have any recommendations for our audience? Maybe, the last book that really blew you away.
I just finished When We Cease to Understand the World by Ben Labatut. I'm not sure I'm saying his name correctly. And it did blow me away. It was one of those books that you thought, is this an essay? Is this a novel? I don't know, but the voice is overwhelming and compelling. And even though it doesn't, quote unquote, have a plot in the way that I often relate to in like a Victorian novel or all sorts of novels, I read it in one big gulp. So that was something I loved recently.
And what was the title again?
When We Cease to Understand the World.
Okay. All right. Patricia, how about you?
One that I read recently was Carolina de Robertis' new book, The President and the Frog. I loved it. And I'm currently reading Lauren Groff's new one and enjoying it very much as well.
Excellent. Matrix, The Matrix, right? I believe it is.
I'm not sure if it's Matrix or Matrix.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
All right. I stand corrected.
Oh,
okay, great. Well,
I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay. I'll just put a little shout out to Anthony Doerr's forthcoming novel. I think comes out in about a week. Cloud Cuckoo Land. Really, really great novel. So I'm really sorry, but we're out of time. Thank you so much, Patricia and Rivka, for sharing your time with us so generously, and thanks to the entire audience for your questions. You can learn more about our authors and keep enjoying the National Book Festival at loc.gov/bookfest. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone who's here.